Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming back. We'd like to get started now. This afternoon, we are going to have a similar format. Two of our presenters here are going to give a speech, 15 to 20 minutes, please. And then a third participant is going to join us from his office in the United States. As I said in the first session, what we're going to start looking at in this section are some of the issues related to governance, continuing the discussion about the need to debate, to discuss strategies we can be looking at for cooperation between states, among states, and within states. Our panel tonight is as eminent, as experienced as our previous panel. We have Dr. James Stavridis, former U.S. Navy Admiral, currently Dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. We have Dr. Abdelqader Fahmi, Specialist in Political Science and IR from the University of Jordan. And joining us on Skype, in a minute, we have Dr. Thomas Lynch. Hi, Tom. Retired U.S. Army and a distinguished research fellow at the Institute of National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University, Washington, D.C. So we're going to ask James to get us going, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to come to this beautiful country and say a few words. I thought I would talk about the challenges we face from violent extremism and then speak about some ideas for how we might address them. I will pick up some of the ideas from the previous panel, and I look forward to a dialogue with all of us and hearing from you as well. I will show a few pictures as I go along, and I'll begin with this, which is 20th century security. This was a time when threats were faced that emanated from large armies.
Thank you.
This is a photograph from the Battle of Stalingrad, where 1 million people were killed in a single battle. We tried very hard in the 20th century to protect ourselves by building walls. And walls do not succeed in creating security. This, of course, was the Berlin Wall during the Cold War when we tried to separate ourselves from our Soviet opponents. When I began to realize that walls do not work in security was on this day, on 9/11. The little red circle was my office on that day. I was at the time a one-star admiral, working for General Pace, who was a four-star general. And I had a chance, because of my location in the Pentagon, to actually watch the airplane hit the building. I'm lucky to be with you today. And it was at that moment that I realized that building walls to protect us will not keep us safe. At that moment, I was in a very safe place, behind big walls, defended by a big military. I was not safe. It is because the violent extremist threat we face today can go around walls. We know this from the news just yesterday. These were school children in Pakistan. They were protected by a strong army, the Pakistani army, but they were not safe. 134 of them were killed yesterday, children, by violent extremists. Some escaped, but it should remind us that behind walls, behind security, we are not safe and our children are not safe. There is violent extremism in many parts of the world. I showed you a photograph from Pakistan. This is Afghanistan, nearby, where a man is shooting a woman in the back of the head following the judgment of a Taliban court. But of course, it's not only in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Violent extremism exists around the world. This is in a very small, quiet country in Europe. This is in Norway. This handsome young man killed 77 young Norwegians. They were between the ages of 18 and 24 when they were killed. His name is Anders Breivik. You see him on the left side of the screen in court. He was captured. He is in court apologizing. He is apologizing to the forces of right-wing nationalism for not having killed more people on that day. This is violent extremism, and it cuts across and threatens all of us. More recently, we saw incidents in Canada and in Australia, as was discussed in the previous panel. This is a Canadian soldier who was killed. This is a photograph of the most recent incident in Sydney. And of course, closer to this nation, we have the rise of the Islamic State, which is, I would argue, more dangerous than many other organizations we have seen for two reasons. One, upper right, is money. They are very capable of generating income, and this is a source of power for this group. Secondly, because of their ability to advertise, to brand themselves, to create a sense that they are bigger than they actually are. They are very clever at strategic communications, perhaps the best of all these violent extremist groups that we have seen. They use extreme barbarity, very visually, as we all know. And as General Pace said, they have a plan. You can go on the internet and read this plan. We should pay attention. We should understand that this is a very dangerous group, and I think different in many ways than what we have seen before. And of course, it is not simply a small group of people from only Iraq and Syria. The nations in red are nations that have citizens who today are part of Daesh, of the Islamic State. And we should listen to them. These are 3 British citizens who are part of the Islamic State. And they speak in their British accents, describing why they became part of this movement. Now, it's not only the groups I've talked about, we should recognize also in Africa. This is the result of Boko Haram, which means Western learning is forbidden. Boko Haram is in Nigeria. This is the group that has kidnapped 200 young girls. We should also recognize another aspect to violent extremism around the world today is money. Where does the money come from? It comes from many sources, but one of them is in this photograph. This is, of course, poppy, which is turned into opium and heroin. 90%, 90% of the world's heroin and opium come from Afghanistan. And the funding from this is used to fuel violent extremism. And of course, in the Americas, in the United States, the problem is cocaine, a different drug. Cocaine comes from largely South America. This is a photograph of a U.S. Navy vessel capturing a drug runner. The bad news is that the U.S. Navy vessel is the one on top in the photograph. The one on the bottom, the high-tech submarine, was built in the jungle of Colombia by violent extremists. The so-called FARC were participants in this drug running scheme. So these violent extremists are funded by a variety of means, including narcotics, and that should be of concern to us as well. They are also increasingly capable of operating in the cyber world, in using it for propaganda, for actual computer attacks, for military purpose, and to create a sense of chaos. So these groups are increasingly sophisticated in their ability to use a wide spectrum of technologies and tools as they pursue violent extremist goals. And lastly, they tend to feed on a sense of inequality, financial inequality, which puts fuel into the fire of all of this. So this is a survey of the challenges we face today from violent extremism. The topic of our panel is the terrorist threat. So I thought I would begin with all of that. I've shown you many different challenges, and right now you should think, okay, what should we do about it? What can we consider as we think about working our challenges together? The stock answer, the obvious answer that occurs to people is this, is military force. And there are certainly times when we need hard power. There is no question of this. But we need other tools as well. And I would start with this. It is simply listening. The first panel talked about this at some length. This is an air defense system from about 80 years ago, 90 years ago, when people listened for the airplanes coming in. I put it here today as metaphor for the fact that we can all learn to listen better than perhaps we have. And I think we should also do more of this, reading and learning about other cultures. These are novels. These are fictional books. But by reading fiction, we can learn about other cultures and how they feel and understand, as part of our desire to listen, that we also read and learn about other nations. We should also do what is implied by this picture. This is a naval college in the United States. It is a place where military officers are sent to stop for a year, to build intellectual capital, to listen, to read, to have a dialogue with each other, so that they can do the other thing that is in this picture, which is build bridges. If I have a summary of my view for you, it is that building walls to create security, which we tried so hard to do in the 20th century, is not the answer. The answer is building bridges. To build bridges, we need to begin by listening and learning about others, then having the dialogue that permits us to improve. Another way we can connect and improve our dialogue is a simple one. It is the study of languages. We should spend more time literally learning each other's languages. To know another language is to know another life. It is the ability to reach across the cultural divide. I do not speak Arabic. I'm sorry, I do not. I speak French and Spanish, Portuguese and Greek and English. And every time I have a conversation in those languages, it is so much closer than if I am reaching across translations, as some of us are forced to do today. This is a young Canadian corporal who taught himself Pashtun during a deployment to Afghanistan. Not perfectly, but he was able to communicate much more effectively. We also need to operate in coalitions, to work together. This is a coalition that you may not have heard as much about. We talk a lot about the coalition against the Islamic State, the coalition in Afghanistan, previous coalitions and military actions. This is the coalition against piracy. It's the broadest coalition operating in the world today. 70 nations are participating in this. It's an example of reaching out to others and recognizing that no single nation is capable of taking on all of these challenges at once. We also need more of this kind of military activity. This is disaster relief. This is a hospital ship. It sails on voyages to conduct medical diplomacy, not just with military officers in the ship, but also with Red Cross, Red Crescent, Doctors Without Borders, Project Hope, Operation Smile. Many private humanitarian organizations sail in these ships. This helps create bridges. We need bridges like this. This is a picture of Afghan policemen who are reading books, which you know is strange because Afghans in this age group, collectively, many of them, almost all of them, cannot read because the Taliban withheld education. So these Afghans are reading because they are in literacy class. They are being taught to read. They are being taught to fight also. But this balance of teaching and using both soft power and hard power is the appropriate way, I believe, to conduct our best chance in this part of the world. We need to think more about the role of women and how they can play a part in creating security. We need to be involved in the social networks. This is the world according to Facebook in this photograph. The brighter the white light, the higher the concentration of Facebook users. I assure you, violent extremists are using the social networks. These social networks are the command and control nets, for many of their activities. We need to be involved in these networks as well to move the positive messages. We need organizations that can operate in the larger world and help connect with the youth in terms of turning them away from violent extremist activity. One that I would highlight is the Global Counterterrorism Forum, which is a United Nations-sponsored entity that helps connect on these social networks in reducing violent extremism. And as was mentioned in an earlier presentation, there are global aspects to this, but in the end, so much of this work has to be done at the local level. There are challenges like portrayed in this picture. Upper right are two young women from Austria. Bottom right, you see them after they have joined the jihad with Daesh and posted their pictures on the internet. On the left side are two women who have founded Sisters Against Violent Extremism. The one on the bottom is Ambassador Farah Pandit of the United States. This is an organization that seeks to reduce the kind of violent extremism we see today. And I would also say that organizations like Trends and other think tanks around the world have a real role to play here in conducting the research and the analysis that helps us understand the fundamentals that create these challenges for us. So to conclude, here is a picture of migrants standing on a beach in Africa. They're trying to raise their cell phones to get a better signal. I put it here to remind us that in so many parts of the world, people want to connect. They want to be part of this globalized civilization. The degree to which we can build bridges and connect them will be the degree to which we are safer in this world. There will be times when we need hard power, when we operate together in coalitions, as the UAE and the United States have done in Libya, today in the challenge of the Islamic State, in Afghanistan. But I would argue over time, it is like this. It is a switch that moves, a rheostat, this is called. And you turn the dial. There are times when you need hard power, but many times when soft power is more effective, certainly in the long term. The ability to move that dial is smart power. My last picture for you. This is Wikipedia, which is an enormous online encyclopedia of knowledge created by all of us. All over the world, people add knowledge. Every day, millions of people draw on it. Wikipedia is a perfect example of the fact that no one of us is as smart as all of us thinking together. That's what conferences like this are all about. A chance to come together, have a dialogue, build bridges, and think together about how to create security in the 21st century. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. That was very good.
Very good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Very good to build upon what we did in the morning, but also to introduce the ideas of the hard power and soft power element, something obviously that was very much part of our earlier discussions. I'll now ask Dr. Abdelqader to please present.
Thank you very much. السادة الحضور السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. في البداية لا يسعني إلا أن أتقدم بالشكر والاحترام والتقدير لدولة الإمارات العربية وقيادتها على كرمها وضيافتها، وهذه الدولة مشهود لها في الكرم العالي والمتابعة العلمية في مختلف مجالات المعرفة. وأيضا نتقدم بالشكر الجزيل لمؤسسة ترند لاستضافتنا لأن نقدم ما هو مفيد في هذا المجال، وآمل أن يكون تقديمنا لما طرح من أفكار في الجلسة الأولى وفي الجلسة الثانية أن يكون مفيد لخدمة هذا البلد العزيز قيادة وشعبا. استمعت في الجلسة الأولى إلى أفكار بناءة ومفيدة جدا وعلى قدر كبير من الرؤية الواسعة والعميقة، لكن وجدت نفسي أسبح في متاهات فكرية ما بين الفلسفة الأفلاطونية وما بين الفلسفة الميكافيلية. أين نحن من كل من الفلسفتين؟ وأيضا جذب انتباهي في هذه الأوراق هو أننا نمسك بالمشكلة من الأخير، يعني قضية الإرهاب وداعش ومسائل الأمن نمسك بها من نتائجها وليس من مسبباتها. هذه ملاحظتين أساسيتين حبيت أن أطرحها في البداية. ورقتي هي يعني ورقة بسيطة تحمل عنوان مكانة التطرف في البنية الأيديولوجية للحركات الجهادية الإسلامية، وأخذت نموذج داعش والدور الذي يقوم به أو تقوم به داعش سواء في سوريا أم في العراق. والحقيقة أنا بديت في هذه الحركة الإرهابية ودفعتني إلى أن أرجع إلى قراءات تاريخية قديمة، ووجدت فيها يعني أشياء على قدر كبير من الأهمية. أولا في البداية أحب أن أقول، وكما تفضل أحد المداخلين، هو أننا ينبغي أن نميز ما بين التطرف وما بين الإرهاب، وهناك العديد من الحركات المتطرفة ينبغي أن لا تجير فقط على الحركات الإسلامية، وأنهما حركات أخرى يمكن أن تكون متطرفة ظهرت في البلاد العربية، في المنطقة العربية، في أوروبا، في أمريكا إلى آخره. لكن في تقديري وجدت أن الاختلاف ما بين التطرف والإرهاب هو الاختلاف بالدرجة. التطرف يعني اعتقاد راسخ وإيمان وقناعات من الصعوبة إزالتها، لكن عندما تنتقل هذه القناعات والاعتقادات من حيز الفكرة إلى حيز الواقع مقترنة بسلوك عنيف، يمكن أن نسميها بالإرهاب. هذه ملاحظة. الملاحظة الثانية هو أن هذه الحركات حقيقة يعني تدعي أنها إسلامية، لكنها في واقع الحال هي بعيدة عن مبادئ الدين الإسلامي. إذا أردنا أن ندرس أو درسنا الدين الإسلامي بشكل واضح وبشكل متعمق ومتأني، وحقيقة وجدت أن هذه الحركات بعد دراستي لها أنها تقتبس أو تجتزئ من القيم والتعاليم الدينية والقرآن الكريم والسنة النبوية الشريفة، تجتزئ أشياء بما يفيدها، وبالتالي تجير كل ما تقوم به على الدين الإسلامي، وخصوصا في موضوعين أساسيين، هي قضية الخلافة وقضية الجهاد. ولن أدخل في تفاصيل كل من الموضوعين لأنها تفاصيل كبيرة وعديدة، ولكن أنتقل إلى تنظيم الدولة اللي يعرف بتنظيم داعش. ولماذا نشأت هذا التنظيم؟ هذا التنظيم هو في واقع الحال هو عبارة عن انشقاق فكري من التيار القاعدة، وبعد أن انشق ما يسمى بأبو بكر البغدادي في عام 2013 عن تقديم الولاء والمبايعة لأيمن الظواهري، أسس هذا التنظيم. وكان هذا التنظيم يعني أو قام هذا التنظيم بعمليات عسكرية وقتالية في سوريا، شرق سوريا والمناطق الغربية من العراق وشمال العراق. وتميز هذا التنظيم بقدرة قتالية عالية حقيقة. واللي لفت انتباهي هو أن هذا التنظيم يضم ما يقارب 30,000 مقاتل. اللي لفت انتباهي فيه هو أن 80% من المقاتلو داعش من جنسيات أجنبية، فرنسية وألبانية وأوروبية مختلفة وأمريكية مختلفة الجنسيات. و20% من هؤلاء حسب التقديرات والإحصاءات 20% يحملون جنسيات عربية يعني أو من مناطق في وسط آسيا. هذا التنظيم حقيقة وجد نشاط وحاضنة إلى في العراق، وهذا التنظيم تبنى عقيدة قتالية تقترب كثيرا من عقيدة حرب العصابات، ولن أدخل في هذه المسائل. لكن ما يهمني في هذه العقيدة العسكرية اللي تبنتها داعش هو طبيعة القتال. يعني هذه المجموعات المسلحة تدربت بجاهزية قتالية عالية على مستوى التدريب والتسليح والتجهيز، وأيضا تتمتع بنوع من التلاحم المتين والصلب ما بين بنائها العقائدي الفكري وما بين روحها المعنوية وقدراتها القتالية. ولم ألاحظ كظاهرة أن هذه التنظيمات يعني أسهر منها، وإنما كانت نتائج الاشتباكات هي قتلى. هذه نقطة. النقطة الثانية أن هذه التنظيمات أو الجماعات المسلحة حاولت أن تجر القوات الحكومية في العراق إلى معارك تختلف تماما في مسارح العمليات لما تقوم به القوات النظامية، وبالتالي كان من الصعوبة بمكان أن يتم رصدها كهدف ثابت، وإنما هي أهداف متحركة يصعب القضاء عليها بضربة عسكرية واحدة، وتعتمد بذلك على أسلوب خفة الحركة والسرعة في الانتقال مقابل جيوش نظامية تتميز بثقل حركتها في نقل المعدات والدبابات والدروع وناقلات الجنود وإلى آخره، وهذا ما استفادت منه. أيضا النقطة الأخرى اللي تبنتها هذه المجاميع القتالية الإرهابية المسلحة هو أنها اشتبكت أو تداخلت في المدن، وبالتالي وجدت نوع من الاستجابة الفكرية والتعاطف ما بين أصحاب المدن في العراق وما بين هذه القوات، وهذه أسباب عديدة سأعكف عليها أو أعرج عليها سبب في ذلك. هذا في الحقيقة منطق العقيدة القتالية لحرب العصابات، هو هذا التداخل، أنها تدخل في المدن وبالتالي يصعب التمييز فيما بينهم، ويعني عمليات الحسم العسكري تكون هنا معقدة جدا. وحتى سلاح الجو اللي مارسته قوات التحالف أصبح أمام خيارين: أما أن يدخل في ضربات عسكرية جوية وتكون نتيجتها الآلاف من القتلى والجرحى من المدنيين، وهذا ما حدث، وأما أن يكون هناك قيود تمنع هذا السلاح الجو من أن يمارس مهامه القتالية في ساحة العمليات. وعلى هذا الأساس كان كثير من التصريحات المعنيين والقادة العسكريين، وخصوصا وزير الدفاع الأمريكي السابق هيل أشار إلى أن مسألة الحسم العسكري بالضربات الجوية مسألة على قدر كبير من الخطورة ولا تحسم معركة. وأيضا هناك الكثير أشاروا إلى أن مسألة الاشتباك سواء على الأرض أم من الجو مسألة معقدة، ولهذا خرجت تصريحات رسمية يعني من قبل رئيس الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية وغيرهم من المعنيين بأن مسألة القتال ستطول وتأخذ فترة طويلة جدا، لأن عملية وجود هذه الخلايا هي ليست جيش نظامي ومواجهة نظامية، وإنما هي يعني بؤر يصعب السيطرة عليها، وبالتالي هي متداخلة مع المدن. النقطة الأخرى اللي حبيت أن أشير لها هو أنه لماذا داعش في العراق؟ لماذا داعش في العراق؟ وأصبحت ظاهرة يعني مقلقة للجميع. داعش حقيقة البحث فيها وفي فكرها دفعني إلى أن، مثل ما ذكرت في بداية حديثي، إلى أن أرجع إلى بعض الحركات الجهادية السلفية تاريخيا. من الناحية التاريخية وجدت بأنه هناك بعض الحركات الفكرية، مثلا الفرق الباطنية اللي تعلن ما لا تضمر، ووجدت بأن هذه الفرق الباطنية مثلا الفرقة الإسماعيلية اللي هي تمثل أو تعود إلى إسماعيل بن جعفر الصادق، هذه الفرقة قياداتها في الحقيقة يعني في ذهن القيادة شيء يختلف تماما عن فكر الأتباع، وبالتالي أيضا لاحظت أن هذه الحركات الباطنية كانت السبب الأساس في تشويه حقائق عن الدين الإسلامي. وأيضا لاحظت أن هذه الحركات بفعل هذا التشويه كانت تخدم مصالح دول كبرى. ولنتذكر موقف القرامطة من الدولة البيزنطية في العصر الدولة العباسية، وهؤلاء الحركات الباطنية في الحقيقة يعتقدون يكفرون الغير. ومن هنا في أيضا يمكن أن نتذكر دور الفاطميين وكيف صدرت الفتوى من الحاكم بأمره في عام 1009 بحرق كنيسة القيامة في مصر، وكانت هذه الشرارة ربما الشرارة الأولى لاندلاع الحروب الصليبية. وأيضا استخدموا نفس المنطق الذي تستخدمه داعش، هو المنطق التفكيري السلفي، وبالتالي هذا المنطق يؤدي إلى اشتباكات وصراعات مما يمهد للقوى الخارجية لأن تتدخل لسبب أو لآخر. وأيضا لابد أن نتحدث عن الانشقاق الفكري الكبير الذي جاءت به النظرية الإمامية، والتي كانت سببا في ظهور هذه الحركات المتطرفة. ولاحظت من خلال دراسة التاريخ لهذه الحركات أنه بلاد فارس كانت هي المصدر الأساس لتصدير كل هذه الحركات الإسلامية المتطرفة. لماذا داعش في العراق؟ حقيقة أسباب عديدة. السبب الأول هو الممارسات الحكومية التي مارستها حكومة المالكي ضد المكون السني، وهذا أدى إلى أن يكون هناك نوع من الاشتباك واللا تلاقي بين الجانب الرسمي والجانب يعني مع شريحة من المجتمع. هذا جانب. الجانب الآخر أنه كثير من القيادات والزعامات القبلية وجدت في داعش الظهير العسكري المساند لمواجهة القوات المسلحة الحكومية، ولم تكن في الواقع جماعات أو تشكيلات عسكرية حكومية، وإنما كانت مسندة بميليشيات مسلحة تقوم بأعمال مساندة للحركات لنشاط القوات المسلحة. وللاحظت أيضا، وهذا ما يدعو إلى انتباه، وهذه ملاحظة لها مغزى، أنه نشاط داعش كان تماما، إذا كانت هي حركة سلفية جهادية إلى آخره، تركز نشاطها في كل المناطق، وليس معظم، في كل المناطق السنية، في 5 محافظات سنية كان نشاطها مركز في هذه المحافظات. ويؤسفني أن نتحدث في منطقة الطائفية أو منطقة التقسيم الطائفي على المستوى الجغرافي للعراق، أن المحافظات الشيعية في الجنوب لم تتعرض لمثل هذه الحركات أو لهذه الأعمال التي قامت بها هذه الحركات. أيضا عندما وصلت هذه الحركات إلى مستوى من الضغط على الجانب الحكومي، نجد أن الاستجابة لدعمها كان متأتي من جهتين: إيران اللي فتحت باب التطوع للقتال في العراق، وأيضا دخول فيلق القدس في العراق، وبعد ذلك الانفتاح على كل المحافظات، معظم المحافظات السنية. وكانت الدعوة تحت غطاء المحاربة، محاربة القوات أو محاربة هذه الجماعات لحماية الأماكن الدينية المقدسة. أما رد الفعل الثاني فهو كان من داخل العراق، وكان على مستويين. المستوى الأول هو المستوى الديني المذهبي، واللي يتمثل بالفتوى اللي أصدرها المرجع الأعلى السيستاني، ودعا فيها إلى ما يسماه بالجهاد الكفائي. والجهاد الكفائي بالمفهوم الإسلامي إلى دلالاته حقيقة، هي دعوة إلى القتال في الداخل، وليس دعوة إلى قتال من يتصدى من الخارج أو لتصدي لمن هو من الخارج. أما الشق الثاني في الاستجابة العراقية من الداخل فقد كانت تمثل بالقوات الحكومية، حشد عسكري من القوات الحكومية مسند من قبل ميليشيات عسكرية مسلحة هي ليست نظامية، وأيضا ما سمي بقوات الحشد الشعبي. وقوات الحشد الشعبي هذه كانت عبارة عن تشكيلات شعبية تحمل السلاح، وهي أصولها يعني من حزب الدعوة اللي الارتباطات واضحة حقيقة مع إيران. بالنسبة للاستجابة الأمريكية في الحقيقة كانت هنا، هذه هو النقطة المهمة. الاستجابة الأمريكية في البداية كانت سلبية، وكانت في واقع الحال متأخرة. سلبية لأن عندما أعلن الرئيس الأمريكي أوباما في 11 حزيران 2014 بأننا لن نقاتل في العراق، وعلى حكومة المالكي أن تتولى هي مسألة الدفاع عن ما يحدث، وهي أيضا متأخرة لأن الضربات الأمريكية وهذا الدعوة إلى هذا الحشد الدولي جاء في وقت متأخر. هذه الحالة أدت إلى تشكيل مدارس فكرية سواء في داخل العراق بشكل خاص أم يعني من يتابع الشأن داعش ويتابع الشأن العراقي والسياسة الأمريكية. نعم. شكرا. ما أريد أن أقوله بدون تفاصيل هي ملاحظة تقدم بها الأستاذ الفاضل من وزارة الخارجية، إلى أنه أنا في تقديري راح أركز على ما أسميه بنظرية الضد النوعي. نظرية الضد النوعي، وهذه النظرية تشتغل عندما يكون هناك ضد، عندما يكون هناك فكرة وينبغي أن تكون هناك عمل مضاد لهذه الفكرة. مثلا نأخذ على سبيل المثال القاعدة زرعت في أفغانستان وكان لها دور معين هو أن تعمل بالضد من التدخل السوفيتي في أفغانستان، قوة الصد. أيضا عندما جاءت الثورة الإيرانية كانت هذه الثورة بحاجة إلى ضد نوعي لمواجهتها. العراق دخل كضد نوعي لمواجهة الثورة الإيرانية للحد من الخطر الذي تحمله شعارات تصدير الثورة، عدم الاعتراف بالأنظمة السياسية العربية واعتبارها غير شرعية إلى آخره. أيضا عندما عندما انتهت الحاجة إلى كل من أفغانستان، القاعدة في أفغانستان والعراق بعد 1988، كان هناك خطر العراق، بروز العراق، وأيضا الطامة الكبرى هو احتلال العراق للكويت في عام 1990. كان لابد أن يكون هناك ضد نوعي لمواجهة العراق. الضد النوعي لمواجهة العراق هنا تمثل بالولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، وبعد أن تم القضاء على نظام الحكم في العراق في 2003 ظهرت نوع من المقاومة في الداخل، كانت بحاجة إلى ضد نوعي. الضد النوعي تمثل بقوات الصحوة، وهي قبائل وعشائر سنية استخدمت ووظفت لمواجهة القاعدة، وأيضا صار اشتباك. بعد أن انتهى دور الصحوات تم اغتيالهم وتصفيتهم قيادات ومجموعات قتالية تابعة للصحوات. بعد أن زادت قضية الاعتصامات والمطالبة وهذا الفرز الطائفي، كان لابد أن يكون هناك ضد نوعي. الضد النوعي ظهر وهو داعش اللي قامت بعمليات عسكرية في العراق. لكن ما يلفت الانتباه هو كلمة أخيرة استأذنك أستاذ دكتور ريتشارد، أنه هذا السكوت الأمريكي اللي ولد قناعات أن هناك تحالف أمريكي إيراني لما يجري، لأن كل العمليات يعني اللي حدثت هي ضد المكون السني. والبعض كان ينظر إلى أن مسألة يعني الرؤية الأمريكية في العراق أو في المنطقة العربية لا تخرج عن، يعني كانت تحمل رؤية مزدوجة. السنة يعني كطرف مقاوم أما يصنف كأحزاب سياسية وهي إرهابية، وأيضا يعني السنة كمقاومين ينتمون إلى حركات إسلامية فهي أيضا إرهابية، وبالتالي صنفت المسألة على أنهم كلهم إرهابيين. يعني هذا كان مطروح على الساحة العراقية. وأخيرا أقول أن مسألة الأمن اللي أثيرت في الجلسة الأولى في منطقة الخليج، ينبغي أن يبدأ الأمن بأمن الفرد ومن ثم أمن المجتمع وبالتالي أمن الدولة، وبدون جهود متكاتفة لا يمكن أن نحقق الأمن. وشكرا لسماعكم، شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. I mean, the final point, I think, is essentially a great almost summary to the whole event. The security of the individual, the security of the individual in society, the state, the region, it all builds. But it builds from the bottom up, and I think perhaps that's probably one of the most important things. fascinating history of the sort of ideology involved in the movements, especially the ISIL movement, as well as the various responses and the differences within the movement in dressing in different ways. Obviously, we'd like to see a much bigger discussion of that at some stage. But moving on, pressing on, I would like to turn the podium over to Dr. Tom Lynch. Tom, all yours.
Great, thank you very much, Richard. Assalamu alaikum from here in Washington, D.C. I'm delighted to be joining you today by Skype and the wonders of modern technology. But I'm also very sad to not be with you today and apologize to the organizers for the visa challenge that was unanticipated, and thank them very kindly both for the invitation and for the flexibility on finding a way to incorporate me here today. I'm indeed richer by being able to participate in this panel, but poorer for not having had a chance to hear my colleagues on the first panel or to get a chance to interact with you all directly and face-to-face. I look forward to working with Trends more in the future and to a future event there in Abu Dhabi sometime soon. Again, with thanks to the organizers, let me just say that from here at National Defense University in Washington, I'm coming to you speaking on the topic that I was asked to look at for purposes of this panel. And that was to discuss what fuels terrorist groups such as ISIS and what should be done to counter them. And I discussed this with you from the perspective of my work as an individual researcher, not as a current representative of either the National Defense University's position or the positions of the Department of Defense of the United States government. So what I thought I'd do with you today, and acknowledging that I'm falling in on very learned and astute commentary from my distinguished colleagues on the previous panels and on the DS here, is to talk about perhaps a way of framing and understanding of an answer to this question about terrorism, its origins and the like, in a slightly wider manner than that which is predominant in the literature. Specifically, when I look at this topic in my research or when I teach at the National Defense University or here at Georgetown as an adjunct, I try to widen the aperture and ask the question of how have we understood terrorism over time? And indeed, what are the lines of thinking that might enable us to look past a lot of the literature of the last 15 or 20 years, which tends to narrowly focus on the salient features of local conditions facing terrorist groups, and particularly recently focusing on religious extremist groups, and instead look at a longer trend and some of the points of analysis that might enable us to better understand things, independent of religious background, but more focused on the very sinews, both at a societal level and then at an individual level. And when I take that look, I come back around to a school of thought known in the literature as rational choice. So what I thought I'd do today is just do a brief summary of kind of, what rational choice tells us about the conditions that frame terrorism, and how that sets the conditions for us understanding not just groups such as ISIS, which I'll talk about towards the end of my presentation, and I know that you've heard much about it today, but also underpins an understanding of other clearly non-religious terrorist groups, such as those of the Basques of northern Spain, such as those of the Irish Republican Army in Northern Ireland, and also such as those of the Tamil Tigers of Sri Lanka. Indeed, I think each of these groups that were both durable and pernicious as terrorist actors, tell us a lot about how to think through some of the preconditions and therefore some of the counters that are feasible in this area. So let me start then by talking briefly about how one might, in the terms of rational choice theory, think about framing terrorism, violent extremism, and what success looks like if we're trying to define successful terrorist organizations. First, in terms of the definition of terrorism. And here I apologize for, I'm sure you've probably already gone through this a little bit earlier today, but I think it's important to set the benchmark. And here I think the benchmark is debated in terms of how to define terrorism, but it's relatively settled that terrorism basically is the use of violence to obtain political and social objectives through intimidation of a large audience beyond that of the immediate victims. And attendant with that, terrorism requires the perpetrators, both individuals and groups, reject the notion that there are illegitimate targets for the violence. Indeed, it's a rejection of a notion that there are no innocent bystanders and no non-combatants in the struggle. And it's from this position that terrorism gains its pernicious state and gains the abhorrence that it's rightly and richly deserved over time. Next, there's this concept of violent extremism. And all I wanted to offer here, and I go into some detail in the paper that I've provided the conference organizers on this, is that, certainly for the past decade in Western states, there's been this struggle with the distinction between those choosing violence in pursuit of their aims through the influence of either international type causes or objectives from terrorist groups, or whether they're perpetrating this mass violence mainly to domestic grievances or personal ideations. Particularly in the United States, this has been an important debate over the last 10 to 15 years because the United States has been looking for new combinations of federal, local, and international policing and intelligence agencies to deal with things that aren't classically considered to be international terrorism. And so as a consequence of that, we've had this category of discussion, and I know the organizers refer to this in the literature and the material of, what is a homegrown violent extremist. And here I just offer the fact that, in the United States, and I think in many other Western governments, there's kind of been a settling in the last 5 to 10 years on this notion that a violent extremist is one who commits ideologically motivated violence to advance political goals, but does not take direction from a foreign terrorist group or a foreign power. Now, this is a distinction that perhaps is not really a difference, and it's sometimes hard to discern what the motivations are. Say, for example, like the actor in Australia who cloaks himself in the religious flag of violent extremism from the Middle East, but who in fact we are told has a personal record of violence and extremism against others that seems to be clearly not motivated by a wider notion of jihad. So while this distinction is noteworthy, I think it's not decisive in what the group and the organization is discussing today. So let me then talk about how one defines successful terrorism. And here it's very curious, and I think very important to note that almost all the historical literature done on terrorism tells us that the vast majority of terrorist groups fail to achieve their stated objectives, right? And so the few that do succeed generally tend to succeed when they're funded or supported by external state actors. But some terrorist groups do, despite not having state sponsors, seem to achieve at least some of their aims over time. But the over time portion is key here, because the majority of the literature, especially the rational choice literature, suggests to us that the longer a terrorist group exists, the more it acquires an image of success, and that as a consequence, a successful terrorist group really is a group that, on 2 levels and 2 dimensions, has its major calling card. And the first is how durable it is, that is how long it lasts. And the second is the relative intensity of its violence, or what I've called its perniciousness. And that's kind of a measure of being violent enough to be in the public eye, but not so violent that you create the antibodies of everybody being against you and the piling on that tends to eradicate or eliminate terrorist groups very quickly. So with these kind of as the background norms, what I wanted to do is highlight the fact that it's not just, as too much of the literature, I think, especially in Western countries, addresses, it's not just about extremism and religious extremism, but there are extremisms that are based upon ethnic, cultural, social, and economic grievances that go deep into the history of terrorism, and that too often today I think we don't discuss. And here I highlight again that based upon the measures of durability and perniciousness, 3 groups that operated for over 30 years and therefore would meet the definition of a successful terrorist group, the Basques in Spain, the IRA in Ireland, and the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka, are not inherently or directly based upon religious backgrounds. So what then set the preconditions for these groups to rise? That can help inform us about groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda and how to think about countering them. Well, let me talk in 2 dimensions about how rational choice theory and behavioralism helps us understand this, I think. First, what are the background social conditions for successful, that is, durable and pernicious terrorist groups or violent extremism? While there are many conditions that are involved here, I think rational choice theory points us in the direction of important ones. First, there must be an overarching narrative in favor of grand and indiscriminate violence as the necessary tool for effecting political or cultural change, right? And so, as a consequence, this narrative most often stems from an environment of hopelessness and a feeling of lack of inclusion. And that lack of inclusion can be political inclusion, cultural inclusion, ethnic inclusion, economic inclusion, or that which gets most of the oxygen in the discussion today, religious inclusion. And that narrative can involve from a variety of locations, not just within mosques and madrasas, but throughout history in places like pubs, bar rooms, isolated work camps, university campuses, or churches or mosques. And again, I point to Ireland, Spain, and Sri Lanka as examples of places where these types of grievances and these types of narratives have gained traction over time and are as very important as those locations for states to consider moving forward. In the paper, I go into some detail in discussing how this first condition applies in the three cases in Ireland, Sri Lanka, and Spain, but for time considerations today, I won't go through that. I'll instead turn to the second of the three preconditions, and that is there must be a narrative transmission mechanism and a fighter recruiting, transit, and training capabilities for a terrorist group to take root, to take hold. Now, important in this is the fact that sympathetic nearby countries are very critical, we are told, and the literature and the research suggests, in providing the conditions for a successful terrorist group. So too is a supportive diaspora beyond the confines of the place where the group is active. And I go into some detail in the paper about how in the Spanish case, the Irish case, or the Sri Lanka case, these sympathetic nearby populations and sympathetic nearby countries in diaspora had a lot to do with the durability and the perniciousness of these groups. And finally, and thirdly, in terms of preconditions, there's got to be a multifaceted financing mechanism. And here I highlight multifaceted, and I'll come back to this in a couple of minutes when I talk about ISIS and when I look at where their multifaceted nature is. Now, durable and pernicious terrorist outfits historically do benefit from local resource predation or kidnapping or distortion for a period of time. But history tells us they don't survive with just that basis of funding in the long haul. Long-standing terrorist groups rely upon a broader range of licit and illicit funding mechanisms. We see that they must attract outside contributions through things like cash couriers, direct charitable contributions, skimming of a portion of establishment or front company monies, and businesses capable of money laundering and of exploiting networks well beyond the country or the region they're involved with. And again, in the paper I talk about how the Spanish example, the Irish example, and the Sri Lanka example reinforce this notion. Indeed, Al-Qaeda reinforces this notion. And a lot of the underpinning of Al-Qaeda's success was the diversity and the tethers and the ties to resources and funding mechanisms from the Muslim diaspora worldwide, but particularly in the Islamic world. So I'll come back to that when I talk about ISIS in a couple of seconds. So those then are the three preconditioned narratives that rational choice theory tells us needs to exist for a durable and pernicious terrorist group. But what about individuals who choose to join these groups? And here, I think there are three things that behavioralists, psychologists, and economists who study human nature all agree upon. And first and foremost, the individual motivation to terrorist group organization is this need for the higher order human aspiration, which is belonging and kinship, right? Behavioralists refer to this as an affiliative instinct. Economists observe that this instinct can be manipulated in a process known as fictive kinship, where a nominally believable but often false promise for an in-group to stand against the out-group takes hold. Now, quite often, this kind of a fictive kinship can generate benign or even neutral results. But malign outcomes are extremely possible when groups like this have a precondition toward extremism and terrorism and are allowed to take root in society. So how do these groups take root? Well, generally, in the literature, find that group leaders can generate or exploit the group dynamic by increasing isolation and alienation from their host society and policies. sometimes with the support of states, but more often with the benefit of the blind eye or a lack of capacity by the host state. These groups become separated in perpetual tension with the society. They start to act in a club-like manner, providing mutual aid and a sense of belonging among group members, but simultaneously building norms and expectations of unquestioning member loyalty, deep and lasting commitment to anything asked by the group, and a very important norm towards self-sacrifice that can easily transcend the boundary between peaceful self-sacrifice to extreme violence and even self-destruction on behalf of the group's ideology. As a consequence, then, it's this individual alienation with the choice to extremism and violence, coupled with isolation and alienation that is not arrested by the state, that we are told in rational choice literature is most associated with this propensity toward violence. Now, I think it's important, and I won't go into detail, though, that rational choice studies do demonstrate that poverty and low levels of education are not, and I repeat, are not positively correlated with an individual choice to extremism. So what about these conditions, and how do they apply in a place like Iraq and Syria and with ISIS? Well, I would suggest with ISIS or Daesh only having 3 years of actual history, that there are a number of conditions based upon this understanding that suggest that Daesh could evolve or could emerge into a very significant, dangerous group. However, the jury's still out in some critical areas. First, the local conditions responsible for Daesh's ascent, and I know you've talked about this today, are very familiar to rational choice analysts and other historic groups. Incubated by the extreme oppression of Sunni ethnic groups in both Syria and Iraq in recent years, and accelerated by the civil war in Syria and the oppression by the illiberal government in Iraq, it is understandable that Sunnis felt alienated and would group around a dramatic narrative like the Salafi jihadist narrative in order to push back with extreme violence to fight for the cause. The fact that the isolation had grown to the extent that it grew, and the associations and the affiliations and the club-like status established in this region really does help us understand in this context of why ISIS and Daesh has appeared to this level that it has appeared and has had the success that it's had. So ISIS's short to midterm prospects have a lot to do with the social and political conditions in Iraq and Syria. But its longer term prospects, I would suggest to you, are not quite to the same level of significance, right? First, ISIS relies to an exceptional degree for financial support on local sources. And as Admiral Stavridis and others, I'm sure today have said, this looks very powerful right now. I would suggest to you, though, that historically, I could point to groups like the Tamil Tigers as well as others who have also had a very powerful local network, but that network wanes quickly. And it wanes especially quickly when you have things going on like ISIS is experiencing right now, with these U.S. and coalition airstrikes that President Obama himself announced on Monday have taken out over 200 individual economic way stations and access points in Syria and Iraq that Daesh is relying upon. So that then goes to the question of what are Daesh's sources of outside funding that would allow it to continue on as a durable and pernicious outlet. And here, I think it still remains to be seen if ISIS can establish reliable and robust financial networks beyond Syria and Iraq. Of course, there have been early reports of financial support from traditional Salafi jihadist groups on the Arab Gulf. But these have been followed over the last year by what I would call more significant reports that these outside sources are not yet reliable. Indeed, these sources are under pressure from regional governments to eschew ISIS as a serious threat. And they're also confronting demands from traditional Salafi jihadist beneficiaries like Al-Qaeda. Second, and most importantly, I think ISIS has pursued its recruiting in a very atypical model for a terrorist group. This model generated exceptionally high profile in the global media and has pushed a lot of fighters in its direction. But this atypical approach has simultaneously generated a lot of alienation and backlash. I see this when I read, as I do on a weekly basis, some of the more prominent jihadi websites worldwide. Because ISIS has declared itself autonomous in opposition to Al-Qaeda's longstanding leadership of the Salafi jihadist community, This brazen stand has pushed these groups to push back. I think many of you in the audience will know the reports of a lot of group leaders and fighters traditionally associated with Al-Qaeda who have been finding their way back out of countries like Jordan, and Turkey, and other places into Syria and northern Iraq with the express mission of trying to take down ISIS as a threat to Al-Qaeda. So I guess in general what I'm saying is I think ISIS, what's burning brightly right now, is not immune from historical factors or conditions that tell us what a successful terrorist organization is. And here, I think the jury is still out. And in some ways, ISIS has preconditions that make its long-term viability an enormous question mark. What then about the policy implications? Let me summarize that very quickly here so I know we can get on to the important business of question and answer. I think first and foremost, it's important to understand from rational choice theory that the systematic alienation of subgroups, whether economic, political, cultural, or ethnic, is the critical background for terrorism. And therefore, governments that better promote policies of inclusion and that generate pluralist institutions and encourage a civil society that values diversity and minority representation, these are the ones that do it best at inhibiting a backdrop for violent extremist narratives. Second, and very importantly, I think there are vital steps that governments must take. First, if governments recognize that groups affiliated with extremist narratives are starting to dig in with providing of their own social services, being exclusionary, and being resistant to government control of activities, then these groups can and must be met by governments to rapidly arrest their independent activities, to curb their funding sources, and to provide a swift and stern security response toward any group trying to develop and militarize its own cadre. But simultaneously, governments need to recognize that inclusion and diversity within the political space is what sets the conditions to reduce the prospects for terrorist and violent extremist groups to take root, to reduce the background conditions, the narrative, the financial support, as well as the individual attractiveness to the fictive kinship these groups provide. I think within that space, we can have a worthy discussion moving forward about how to best assist the governments in the wider Middle East, South Asia, and indeed worldwide in providing the types of environments that are not immune from violent extremism. That will always be there, but far more resistant to the attractiveness of the narratives that produce the extremists that we've seen in all too many places over the last 20 to 25 years. With that, I thank you for your attention. I thank you for being able to participate, and I wish you marhaba, and I said thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. That was quite interesting and quite good at the end as well about the inclusion and the diversity. We still have some time, not a lot of time, so both our panelists will be asked to keep their responses relatively succinct. But at the same time, a lot of what was raised cuts to some of the points we finished with at the last session about governance, about the economic aspects, about the social aspects, about the political aspects in practical terms, and how we go about addressing them. I'd like to put it to you first, Admiral. In your presentation, you showed us the complexities. Tom just ended with the idea that we need to work towards inclusion and diversity, and Dr. Abdel's talk brought to light how even within particular movements we have different ideologies, different possibilities, different understandings. Well, you want to take a shot at how we can go about trying to build those bridges that you spoke of? What do we need to actually do?
Sure. I'd say at the beginning, unfortunately, we do need hard power. And I think that's what we're seeing in the struggle with Daesh at the moment. As we move forward, we have to go after the financial sources. I think Tom Lynch talked about that correctly, which is to say that's the fuel in the fire. That's the financial piece is kind of the second closest approach. And then thirdly, we need, again, a sense of political inclusion, of economic inclusion, the ability to be educated, have a job, have a family. These kinds of inclusive acts, I think, are probably the long-term package of solutions. So that means addressing income inequality, a sense of my vote counts in some way, and ensuring that people have the means to connect themselves with the society.
And Tom, in your talk, you spoke of something that I find quite important, the idea of narrative transmission. Would you like to sort of build upon the comments and give us some insights on how we can work towards bring the narrative together, getting diverse views for that diversity inclusion? Can you still hear us?
We spend a lot of attention right now, and I guess rightfully so, at the multifaceted ways in which narratives can be, expounded upon or expressed. I mean, and here in kind of the rational choice theory that I've discussed, I mean, you get to this tension of whether or not you try to, curtail or cut down or eliminate these networks, or whether you try to have multifaceted messaging out there simultaneous that would suggest that there are alternatives, that there are other ways for grievances to be expressed than to turn to extreme violence, and quite frankly, to counter the falsehoods that underwrite some of these narratives about, say for example, the Salafi jihadist narrative, which is, Islam under assault by Westerners and others throughout history, when there are repeating examples of that. I mean, I think here in this notion of competitive marketplace and inclusion and diversity, it's seductive but wrong to try to shut down these other mechanisms of transmission. Instead, it's important to get out there a countering message that shows how diversity and inclusion are being provided to those who may have grievances, to show what else the opportunities are that are out there, and to let the volume of those things provide the alternative viewpoint in the marketplace that then individuals who inevitably will become alienated by the violence and by the vacuous nature of what they're promised in this false narrative, what we'll look for the alternative to be. So I think in that space, it's important about the mechanism of transmission, but it's also important how governments try to counter that, not by repression or suppression of the wrong-minded message, but by countervailing information that's based on reality. So there has to be policies in place, but based on reality where people can look for the alternatives.
Can I have a one-sentence follow-up?
Sure.
People often say we're in a war of ideas, and that is the wrong expression. We are in a marketplace of ideas, and our ideas are good. They can win, but we have to approach it as a marketplace, not some kind of combat.
And as you explained to us, Dr. Abdel, that within your study of the ideology in the extremist movement, the ideas again become very important, but also become very difficult in how they're expressed and how they're understood. So would you like to comment in relation to this idea of a marketplace of ideas?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Richard, was that directed at me? I didn't quite hear the
No, it's to Dr.
target.
Abdel. Hang on, did you get it?
Again, please.
Yeah, what I was asking from your presentation, you talked about how we had the different ideologies within the sort of ISIL movement, how we had different responses to it, and how quite often the differences within the ideology and the differences in the responses essentially leads to more tension. So if we have this marketplace of ideas where the ideas are important, but given the diversity of ideas out there, how do we manage the marketplace?
نعم حقيقة مواجهة الحركات الإرهابية ومن ضمنها داعش والتيارات السلفية الجهادية أنا في اعتقادي أنه تواجه بخطين متوازيين يعني لا يكفي الخط العسكري أو الجانب الأمني وإنما مواجهتها بالجانب الفكري والجانب الفكري أعتقد أنه يلعب دور كبير في تقويض البنية الأيديولوجية اللي تنهض عليها هذه الحركات الجهادية لأن اعتمادها على الفكر الإسلامي هو في الحقيقة اعتماد غير صحيح ومجتزئ وبالتالي ينبغي أن تواجه بأساليب فكرية وليس فقط بأساليب عسكرية ربما يكون الخط البداية أو خط الشروع الأول في مواجهة هذه الحركات هو إعلام الناس بطرق ووسائل إعلامية بأن ما تتبناه هذه الحركات هي في الواقع أفكار هدامة، أفكار إرهابية، وبالتالي يمكن أن نجردها من القواعد الشعبية أو من مصادر يعني اللي يمكن أن تنتمي لها. إضافة إلى ذلك يعني محاربتها في ما تنطلق منه من أفكار أيديولوجية، ومن ثم بعد ذلك يمكن إضعافها على الصعيد الفكري. وهنا تلعب وسائل الإعلام والدعاية دور كبير، وسائل الإعلام حقيقة دور كبير في تجريد هذه الحركات من منطلقاتها الفكرية، وبالتالي تضعف تدريجيا من حيث القواعد الشعبية اللي تعتمد عليها أو من المصادر اللي يمكن أن تنتمي إلها يعني كأفراد وجماعات مسلحة وما شابه ذلك. إضافة إلى ذلك أنا أعتقد أنها يعني فعلا يعني هي صناعة، يعني داعش هي مو حالة سهلة، إنما هي حالة معقدة في طريقة تفكيرها، في طريقة تواجدها، في عملياتها، في كل شيء، في مصادر تمويلها. يعني تصور مثلا واحد من مصادر التمويل يعني بعد ما تم احتلال الموصل من قبل داعش في 10 حزيران 2014 أنه ذكر بمصادر الإعلام أن واحدة من مصادر التمويل هي أنه بيع النفط إلى تركيا أو شيء من هالقبيل هذا. طيب بيع النفط هذا يحتاج إلى ناقلات، يحتاج إلى أنابيب، يعني كيف ينقل النفط؟ وعملية النقل يعني هذه في الحقيقة يعني مو بعيدة عن عمليات الرصد الجوي. يعني إذن أكفت شيء يجذب الانتباه في هذه الظاهرة. إضافة إلى ذلك يعني تمددها في العراق حقيقة ليس فقط مسؤولية حكومية، وإنما هو مسؤولية دولية. أنا أتساءل يعني أين الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية من هذا الانفتاح الإيراني وهذا الدعم يعني بشكل أو بآخر لمسألة داعش؟ ذكر في وسائل الأنباء يعني كثير أنه السيد بايدن يعني أشار في بداية الشهر هذا الحالي أعتقد في 3/12 تعليقا على الضربات الجوية الإيرانية، اختراق الطائرات الإيرانية وضربت أهداف في مناطق معينة ومقصودة الغرض تحت غطاء محاربة داعش، وفعلا كانت داعش موجودة هناك. لكن كان التصريح يلفت الانتباه أنه طالما كانت هذه العمليات العسكرية اللي تقوم بها إيران ضد داعش فهذه العمليات مرحب بها. يعني هذا النوع من الخطاب السياسي يعني يدعو أو دفع الكثير إلى التساؤل، يعني لماذا هذا السكوت الأمريكي عن هذا التمدد؟ حقيقة هي داعش أنا أعتبرها هي وسيلة للنفاذ، يعني ضربت مناطق سنية وعمليات قتال. يعني أنا أسمع الأخبار وأتابع يعني أشخاص من هذه المصادر، يعني عمليات إبادة جماعية، تهجير، قتل، اعتقالات، ضرب على الهوية، والمجتمع الدولي ساكت، يعني ساكت في مكان ومتحرك في مكان آخر. هذا التعامل يعني المزدوج أعتقد ينبغي أن يكون منطلق من مبادئ. يعني عندما نحارب داعش ينبغي أن نحارب من يقف وراها. وثانيا هذا التمدد الإيراني صدقني يا دكتور ريشارد يعني خطير. أنا قارئ تاريخ إيران وما هي الدبلوماسية الإيرانية وكيف تعمل الدبلوماسية الإيرانية. الدبلوماسية الإيرانية دبلوماسية على قدر كبير من الذكاء، وأيضا هي واحدة من الفرق الباطنية يعني اللي أشرت لها. وجغرافيا ترى المنطقة مطوقة، يعني إيران خط الشروع الأول هو العراق للانفتاح على الأردن والجزيرة العربية، ومن ثم عندنا يعني اليمن الآن، وأصبحت المنطقة هذه المنطقة الجزيرة هي منطقة مغلقة تقريبا، وهناك حزب الله وغيره يترقب، وهذه الخلايا موجودة، الحوثيين وغير الحوثيين والحركات السياسية التي حدثت في البحرين هي عبارة عن قنابل موقوتة تنتظر فتوى. شكرا.
Absolutely. And I think that point of the time bombs in many respects, again, just reinforces the work that needs to be done about the various narratives and the counter-narratives. One thing I was glad to see when you spoke about the Global Counterterrorism Task Force, that I know right here in Abu Dhabi, Hidayah is putting a lot of effort into coming up with counter-narratives. And when I worked with Hidayah earlier this year, they were clear. We accept extremist views, that's fine. Everybody can have their own view. But it's when that view gets put into action. So what we need to do is work on the ideas, work on the views, and hopefully get that discussion, keep it going, so we don't end up with these barriers, okay? Yeah, good question. Ahmad, did you want to open with the questions, please? I do have a few questions. Okay, grab the mic.
My first question was for General Pace. I'm sorry, but I didn't get my chance in the first panel session, so here it is. The Gulf Arab countries have an understandable apprehension regarding Iran, as Dr. Fahmi mentioned. This anxiety has been heightened as of late by the feeling of being encircled by Iran's authority. We see this in Bahrain, we see it in Damascus, we see it in Baghdad, and we certainly see it in Sana'a in Yemen. Given the US negotiations with Iran and the concern about that as well, should there be discussion for some kind of regional security agreement that would provide the GCC countries with a security umbrella, both general and nuclear, that would provide them with some greater sense of trust during these tumultuous times? And my question does not represent Trends' opinions, just stating that for the record.
I do not trust Iran, and therefore anything that we would do with the GCC and the countries in the region to enhance collective security in a way that would counterbalance Iranian influence, I would be anxious to pursue.
Thank you. To the panelists, please. Do you have another question? Yeah,
yes,
please. We don't have much time.
Admiral Stavridis. I'd like to ask you about two countries that are potentially the most important building blocks for the Middle East security, and that is Turkey and Egypt. Turkey, a NATO member, has the ability to build a stable Middle East, but doesn't always behave as we would expect. Egypt, on the other hand, where the contradiction between American values and American interests is very poignant, as we saw in the previous panel session, what could or would you do with regard to Turkey and Egypt?
Well, I think your proposition is correct, that the degree to which Turkey and Egypt can cooperate and can work together is profoundly important in the region. These are two enormous economies, and collectively their ability to move the region in a financial sense is very profound. Secondly, as you state, Turkey is a NATO ally, and I think a relationship between Egypt and Turkey helps connect the West with this region. And I would also mention NATO has an organization, a partnership organization that is centered and called the Gulf Cooperative Initiative, which is something that can be built upon as well. Egypt and Turkey could play a role in that as well. So there's a military and an economic dimension to this. And then thirdly, these are two nations that are both enormously populated. So in terms of looking in the region, this is two nations that have great potential to collaborate, work together. I'm hopeful that that will be the case moving forward. Thank you.
Tom, would you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, Richard, sorry, there's a bit of an echo. Could you restate? Was that an address to me?
No, I just didn't know if you had any comments to add to either about the Iranian situation or the role of Turkey in trying to bring about security to the GCC.
Yeah, I think both those are very important questions, and let me just highlight that having had the privilege of living for a number of years and working, within the Gulf countries as well as in South Asia, it's a continuous and somewhat of a Sisyphusian task to try to encourage the Gulf states to consider more collective and common security prospects. And I know that the United States government, as well as many of its partner Western governments, really do wish to continue to encourage the Gulf states to consider doing that. And that said, exclusive of any independent initiatives between the United States government and Iran, although I think all of us that work in this analytical space recognize the level of discomfort that is present in many Gulf states about the overtures that the Obama administration has taken towards Iran, none of which, I might add, have proved particularly successful, but that we should expect will certainly continue in one form or another for the next couple of years. On the point about Turkey and Egypt, I mean, historically, I think you can point to times where Turkey and Egypt have had very positive and engaged relations, but they've also had great gulfs in terms of their policy expectations. I think I would argue that this is one of those periods where there are great gulfs. Egypt has found its way forward, experimented briefly with popular democracy that's produced a religiously based party, and then had the return to a military government. Turkey, of course, over the last decade plus, has been trying to exclude and push aside its military, anchoring the positions of a civilian-led government. So I think there's reason to believe that there's a lot of mistrust in those governments. And while there are certainly points of policy interest and commonality, there's a wary circling that we should expect that will continue to go on for quite a while. And I think outside diplomatic initiatives are going to be required to try to find common ground.
Cool. And Dr. Abdel, you've already spoken to this to a degree. Is there anything else you would like to add?
شكرا جزيلا. حقيقة المحاور كثيرة اللي تطرقت لهذا الموضوع لم يتاح لنا المجال أن نعلق في الجلسة الأولى، وهناك كلام جميل طرح في هذا الموضوع من جهة الفريق ضاحي خلفان والأخ من وزارة الخارجية الهاملي حول هذا الجانب، لكن تشتتت الأفكار حول أكثر من محور: التطرف، الإرهاب، أمن، دور تركيا، دور إيران. كلها أدوار يعني تحتاج إلى فعالية من الفعاليات أو ندوة من الندوات هذه. حتى ما تطرق له أستاذنا الفاضل الآن حول القوى الناعمة وما تشكله من خطر على هذا الجانب أو تلطيف هذا الجو. تطرق زميلنا أولا حول الاتصال والإعلام ودوره في عملية الإرهاب. كل هذه المحاور تحتاج إلى دراسة متأنية وعميقة في كل المجالات. يعني الإعلام له دور في التأثير صحيح، لكن الإعلام أيضا والاتصال المباشر له دور. بحكم أننا أستاذ في الاتصال المباشر في كلية الإمارات للتكنولوجيا، يجب أن يكون هناك أيضا دور للإعلام، له دور إيجابي ودور سلبي في قلب هؤلاء الأشخاص لاشتراك مثلا من دول أوروبا ومن الدول الخارجية لمساندة الجماعة الإرهابية، وله دور أيضا في عملية توعية الناس. نحن لما نطرق القنابل الموقوتة الآن في اليمن، نحن أيضا تعرضنا لهذا الموقف. أمس أكثر من 15 طفل من أطفال المدارس بسبب هذه التفجيرات. أحد المحاضرين ذكر موضوع أنه هناك لا يمكن للدولة أن تتخلى. فعلا الجماعات الإرهابية استولت على الدولة في اليمن، الحوثيين هم الآن يحكموا اليمن مسيطرين، وهناك الأطراف التي تلعب وتمول هذه الجهات. يجب أن لا ننسى الأطراف الخارجية التي تلعب دور. وذكر زميلنا سابقا أنه من غذى الجماعة اللي كانت تحارب السوفيت في أفغانستان أليست الدول الخارجية؟ بالمقابل هناك دول الآن تغذي هذه الأطراف في عملية أيضا الصراع والإرهاب الذي يدور في تلك الدول. وآسف على الإطالة.
Tom, I'm going to turn that one over to you first. The question was primarily about the sort of role of the wider geopolitical situation where we have foreign powers as well as local powers, local influences all coming to a head, and the sort of instability that this creates in the situation, along with some of the issues of awareness in the media. Would you have any sort of contributions on that, please?
Yeah, Richard, thanks. No, I think that's a fair question. And I think it dovetails into something that I kind of saved from my formal presentation, which is what I understand, perhaps not with the questioner, but with a number of my friends from the Gulf states and my colleagues that work there, this kind of concern and worry over what the direction of American policy is and how to understand the foreign involvement, and then the declaration, in Cairo by President Obama about the United States stepping back from the fray, but then the United States having to get back in and involved in very severe dilemmas like Libya and Syria and now Iraq again. Kind of where is all this headed? How does the outside influences, contribute to the issues? I guess what I'd say to that is that, clearly these are highly turbulent times in the Middle East. There are dramatic forces at work here, forces about modernity, forces about connectivity to the outside world, forces about politics and governance and kind of the relationship between civil society and long-standing tribal networks versus more inclusive democratic arrangements. I think all of these are in play. And I think the United States' sense, policy, particularly with this administration, has been to try to not be so directly involved, to try to stand back and both facilitate governments to make their own transitions, as well as to protect themselves against violent extremists. But then, when put in a position where it seems to be a clear and present danger of a group like a Daesh, or perhaps a metastasized Al-Qaeda within, the Syrian civil war space, to reserve the right to intervene militarily then, when it appears that these groups are either one, directly threatening to a allied government interest in the region, and it can't be contained within, or two, that are plotting and planning catastrophic international terrorism. And so, I would just suggest that, the relationship here is certainly one that's correlative, but I don't think it's necessarily causative. And I certainly don't see us, unfortunately, getting to any more certain situation anytime soon. I think the ambiguities and the unfortunate violence are going to continue, and there is going to be outside intervention that's going to, be involved for a while and then try to back out again. But with this ever-present dynamic and this tension of enormous transition and change going on that has violent aspects to it.
Dr. Abdel.
ذكرت القنابل الموقوتة.
نعم.
الآن الامتداد امتد لليمن، وصلت الجماعات، كنا نشكي قاعدة في جزيرة العرب، الآن الحوثيين مسيطرين على البلد بدعم خارجي، إذن في أطراف خارجية تلعب ليس فقط التطرف في قضايا الإرهاب وقضايا الدين، في هناك أشخاص خارجيين هم الأكثر تأثير، وفي البحرين وفي كثير من الدول أيضا تلعب هذا الدور.
نعم، أنا أتفق معك بالرأي. حقيقة المنطقة لا يمكن إبعادها من معادلة التوازن الاستراتيجي، المتطلبات العمل الاستراتيجي ما بين أمريكا وروسيا، الملفات السورية ودور روسيا في سوريا، وأيضا مقتضيات العمل مع البرنامج النووي الإيراني. وهذا البرنامج النووي الإيراني أنا أعتقد أنه في طريقة إلى إلى أن ربما يكتمل، لكن ينبغي أن نأخذ بنظر الاعتبار أنه الاستراتيجية القادمة ستقوم على توازن استراتيجي ليس بأسلحة تقليدية، وإنما بأسلحة فوق تقليدية. هذا جانب. الجانب الآخر، الآن هذه الشكوك التي أثارتها إيران حول برنامجها النووي، هل هناك دلائل على أن هذا البرنامج لا يمكن أن يتطور؟ وبالتالي الدبلوماسية الإيرانية لعبت دور كبير في لعبة المساومة، هي مدعمة من قبل روسيا أيضا، ولها ظهير في المنطقة سوريا، وأيضا الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية لا تملك إلا أن هذه سياسة. بداية أنا كنت حار ما بين منطقين، منطق الأفلاطوني والمنطق الميكافيلي. هذه سياسة أستاذ، والسياسة تقتضي أن تكون المنطقة بهذا الشكل. وأنا لا أعتقد أن الفعل السياسي في المنطقة هو فعل عفوي، وإلا هذه ليست سياسة. السياسة تدبير وعمل من فعل أفراد، ومن من الصعوبة ما كان أن نقول بأن السياسة تخطأ، خصوصا دول عظمى. دول عظمى لا تعرف بالمنطقة ولا تعرف ماذا يترتب على تداعيات الانتشار الإيراني في المنطقة، ولا تعرف هذه الدول العظمى أو الكبرى ما يمكن أن يكون أو يترتب عليه الحال في هذا في حال توسع هذا الخطر. ولزيادة في معلوماتك إذا تسمح لي أستاذ، هو أن هذا الخطر الإيراني ترى مو باليمن فقط، وصل إلى أفريقيا والامتدادات في جنوب شرق آسيا وشرق آسيا وآسيا الوسطى، امتدادات. احنا أخذنا هاي النقطة دكتور، الحركات الإيرانية الدينية ما عندها نشاط متطرف وواجهت الأمريكان ومصالح الغرب وإلى آخره، ولهذا يبدو لي أن هناك نوع من الرضا أو المهادنة لهذه. إيران هي مو منطلقها إسلامي، مو فكري، مو تصدير ثورة وتغيير أنظمة إلى آخره، بس ما ارتكبت الخطأ التفجيري، يعني خطأ السياسات التفجيرية والإرهابية إلى آخره، تدعمهم بس ما عدا حزب الله. وحزب الله يعمل بالمناسبات في تقديري، يعني اكو تحسس كبير من حماس، لكن اكو نوع من يعني الموازنة مع حزب الله. فإذا بالنهاية هم امتدوا إلى أفريقيا والمغرب وجنوب أفريقيا، بأفريقيا يعني جنوب القارة الأفريقية امتدت هذه الحركات الإسلامية الاثنا عشرية والإمامية والى آخره، وبالشرق أيضا عندهم امتدادات ماليزيا وإندونيسيا والى آخره ويلزمون من هذه الحركات. نعم. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Quickly, James, anything to add to that?
I would only say outside intervention has been part of the world for 2,000 years, and probably the biggest one was European colonization of 3/4 of the world. It's a reality, and we have to deal with it. The flip side of that is what I worry about in the United States, which is not intervening more, but a growing sense of isolationism in the United States, a sense that it's all too difficult, and those of us in the United States who believe in engagement need to work hard to ensure that the United States remains interested in being involved, because there is that growing concern, I think, today.
And that quite nicely, actually, we don't have any time. One comment, okay? Do we have a mic, please? Because we're going to be thrown out, unfortunately.
First of all, thank you again to give me a chance, but I need just to finalize that. Let me speak in Arabic. أن الحرب على داعش طغى على هذا النقاش. نحن رأينا أن نحن نتكلم في سياسات في مكافحة التطرف، جذور التطرف. لأني أنا عندي تمنت، أنا أقول أن جذور التطرف موجودة في الدول العربية والدول الأجنبية، ولا أريد أخص بالأسامي. لما نرى مهاجرين عرب لم يعطوا حق العيش بالتساوي مع الجاليات التي هاجروا إليها مثل الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية وأوروبا، نرى الآن هذول متطرفين لأنه عاشوا في بيئة متطرفة حتى على مستوى اسم مدن واسم أسواق، والآن ينتقلون للاقتضاء على من يحاربهم من مواطنينهم اللي عاشوا معهم. إذا نحن إذا نبحث عن التطرف لابد من دراسة جذور التطرف، التهميش، عدم وجود شغل زي ما قال سعادة الفريق ضاحي وأيضا إخواني الآخرين. إذا نحن لابد أن نجلس في مركز هداية، وهو مركز دولي في 29 دولة والاتحاد الأوروبي والأمم المتحدة، وندرس التطرف كبيئة في العالم وليس فقط في المنطقة العربية. وشكرا.
Well said.
And again, I think that just emphasizes the point that we started off with, that nobody is alone in this, but nobody can do it alone either. So the impact, be it the actual fighting on the ground or the ideas far away, all have to be addressed in one way or the other in trying to keep the discussion going between everybody, making sure everybody's part of the discussion and working towards to try to get some level of understanding. Now, I understand there's probably plenty more questions. I do apologize, but we are pressed for time. Again, you'll be able to catch the various speakers at lunch. Everybody is invited to lunch. Before we break up, I just want to do a quick thank you, first off, to Dr. Ahmed for organizing this and bringing it together. Very much appreciate it. In particular, I want to thanks to Emma and Mace, Mace isn't here, the two that essentially brought absolutely everything together, but also want to mention the crew over to the side with Ahmed, Samira, Miriam, and Shine as well, all helping out on the day. And that just leaves me to thank our panelists, Tom far away, our panelists here and the panelists this morning. Thank you very much for coming and joining us. I hope this is just the start, and there's plenty more discussions and conversations to be had. Thank you.